afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Babcock Smith House Museum. There's a lot of new faces here today. Really very rewarding for us. I'm Ellen Madison, and there are a number of other trustees. Andrew and Beck is our chair. Maureen is a trustee. So and Hugh, our brand new trustee. That's right.
Susan.
And Susan. I never should have gone down that road. Before I introduce Maureen, I wanted to say that you're welcome to look at the granite exhibit in the other room after the program. And the house is not open today, but we'd love to have you come back and tour the house. It's the Babcock Smith House, so there are two families. The Babcocks are the colonial family, and the Smiths are the granite family. So we do two things at once. Maureen and I cannot do two things at once, but as a group we do, right? So our next program is in April 21st, and Bob Rieger is going to talk about making prosthetic hands and arms on a 3D printer for those who need them. There's no connection to the Babcock, right?
Not that we know of.
Yeah, not that we know of. And then after that, our open house will be the Saturday of Memorial Day weekend. My brother and I are going to do a program on the connection of the musket that's on the wall to the granite industry. So that should be fun, we hope. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Maureen Bjorkland, who is going to share the story of Wallace Nutting and, oddly enough, the Babcock Smith House.
And I will put a further plug in for touring the house. I am a tour guide of the house. We love doing private tours. If you go to the website, you will find a phone number and an email address. Email or call us, and we'll come in and do a tour for you at any time. We really enjoy giving tours. That's my favorite part of being a trustee. So anytime you want a tour, please go to the website and give us a call. Okay. So, the Wallace Nutting Babcock Smith House connection. About 4 months ago, Ellen Madison came to our board meeting with a book, Connecticut, I say Treasures, Connecticut Beautiful by Wallace Nutting, and a story. And the story was that when Ellen and Linda were cleaning out Gert and Ike Smith's house, this book was on a bookshelf there, and they put it in a box, and they brought it to the museum. And we put it into our auction. At our auction, we had a table with older books on it. So we put it on that table to be sold. At the end of that auction day, it didn't sell. And Ellen and I packaged up all the leftover books and we took them to the Westerly Library so they could sell them. And a couple months went by and Ellen got a call from the library and they said, "Really, Ellen, this should be in your collection." So back the book comes to us. At that point, Ellen nor Linda had ever opened the book. So when Ellen opened the book, she found this letter from Wallace Nutting to Mrs. Phoebe Smith. Phoebe Smith, for those of you who don't know the family, was the last inhabitant of the Babcock Smith House. She was the widow of Orlando R. Smith, Jr. She lived in the house till 1972, and then we turned it into a museum. I say we. Other people besides me turned it into one. So the letter from Wallace is apologizing for the fact that in the Connecticut Beautiful book, he had pictures of Babcock Smith House, but he had attributed them to Groton. He got a little confused as to what state he was in, so he put it in Connecticut. And he mentions how much he loved seeing the house, and he took a lot of pictures. And in the last paragraph, he offers condolences to Phoebe Smith for the death of her husband, Orlando, who died in 1932. The letter was written in 36. And he said, "I'm sorry for your sake, but I'm also sorry for my sake because I quite liked the man," he said. And so inside the letter, there was also a photograph, which I haven't included in my presentation because I couldn't identify any of the people. They were standing in front of the museum, but I couldn't tell who any of the people were, so I didn't want to include it in the presentation. So The Connecticut Beautiful was first published in 23, and then there was a second edition in 35. Okay, next slide, sweetheart. So who is Wallace Nutting anyway? Well, that's a very nice painting of him, and that's in the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford, Connecticut. He was a lot of things. He was a minister, he was a photographer, he was an author, he was a furniture maker, he was an antiquarian. Most what he was an entrepreneur. He took things that interested him and he turned them into businesses, with the exception of the minister part of it. Next slide, honey. So he was born in 1861 in Rock Bottom, Massachusetts. Gotta love the name of that town. And to put 1861 kind of into a frame of reference, that's when the Civil War began. Wallace's father actually joined the Union Army and went to the South shortly after Wallace's birth. And he never returned from the war. He died of a fever in the South in either 1864 or 1865. My dates are going to be fluid here. The different resources gave different dates for when things happened. I kind of tried to nail them down as much as I could, but 1864, 1865. So at that point, his mother moved Wallace and his older sister back to Maine, which is where her family was from. And they lived with various relatives throughout Wallace's life. He started school at 4-year-old, at the age of 4, and I only included that because he had, in his autobiography, he says, the modern stupidity of keeping children back had not then arisen. So I had to put that in there about starting at 4. His high school, he went to Phillips Academy in Exeter, New Hampshire. It's still a prep school and academy and has been since the early 1700s. A number of pretty well-known people graduated from them there. None of them I can remember, so I just remember reading it. He went to Harvard next for 3 years in Massachusetts, and he didn't like Harvard. He came from a poor family. He worked for his room and board during his college years. He worked by staying in people's houses and doing jobs for them or chores for them, essentially. And the rest of the students came from money. And so he felt they were very snobbish. But he spent 3 years there. And then he attended the Hartford Theological Seminary in Connecticut. And from there, he went to the Union Theological Seminary for another year. He graduated from the Union Seminary as an ordained congregational minister. During his high school and college summers, he worked at various resorts as a waiter or a busboy or whatever job he could get. That was kind of what paid his tuition. And he mostly worked on the eastern seaboard, Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, maybe one on the coast of Maine. But in 1886, he worked in the Colorado Rockies for a summer, and it's there that he met his wife. Okay, who said something rude? Okay, she's not a real hooker, but this is an older photo of her, painting of her. Exactly, she's a mature woman. Mary Griswold Caswold Nutting was a young widow when he met her. She was 7 years older than he was, and she also outlived him. He refers to her in his autobiography as his rock. She was a steadying, calming influence on him and supported him in everything. She actually came from Massachusetts, was born in Massachusetts, much like Wallace, but they met in Colorado. Okay, next, honey. So then we'll talk a little bit of him as a minister. His mother decided very early in his life, like pretty much when he was born, that he would become a minister. But he embraced the idea, and from the age of 6 or 7, was writing sermons and preaching to his relatives if they would sit still long enough. He really felt the calling to be a minister. His first church was in Seattle, Washington in 1888. He had a church in Providence, Rhode Island. He had a church somewhere in Mass and also somewhere in the Midwest, I believe Minnesota. But he ended up in Southbury, Connecticut. If you asked Wallace Nutting what he was a minister. He really believed in the ministry. During his early 40s, so 1901, 1902 timeframe, he started to suffer from stress. Being a minister was causing him some anxiety. People didn't believe in the church. They didn't really believe in his teachings. They didn't necessarily listen to him. It caused him a fair amount of stress. So his wife suggested on his Monday mornings, which was really his day off, why don't you take a nice long bike ride, get some fresh air, chill out a little bit. And so he did start to do that. And when he came home, she would ask him, so what did you see today, Wallace? Well, the scenery was beautiful. I went down a road, and that was all he could come up with. So after a couple of times of that, she said, why don't you take your camera with you so I can see what you're seeing, Wallace? So that was really the start of his photography career. In 1904, at the age of 43, he had a nervous breakdown and decided to leave the ministry. He was living in Southbury, Connecticut at the time, and I believe that his wife probably came from a little bit of money. They lived in a very nice home, which he called Nuttingham. Had to get the nutting in there, I guess. So he's leaving the ministry. He's thinking, what can I do now for a living? And this is where his genius kind of comes into play. He wanted to do the photography. People were not really selling photos at that period of time, but he said these looked a lot better in color, but there was no color film at that time. Color film didn't come into play until the 1930s. So he kind of thought of the whole idea of hand tinting his photos. You can change slides, honey. He started to think about hand tinting his photos. He didn't consider himself an artist because he couldn't paint, but in fact, as a photographer, he was an artist. He framed and composed his photos in a beautiful way. He just had an eye for what would look good in a photo. Okay, next slide. So he started his coloring of or hand tinting the photos. This is in his Nuttingham home on the second floor, just in a hallway, and he called the women that painted or hand tinted his photos colorists. Wallace and the head colorist would pick a photo. They would decide what colors it should be. They would paint like a sample, and and they would paint a sample for the colorist to go by. The first group, as I said, was in the upstairs hallway of Nottingham, but there was also a large barn on the back of the property. So once the business started to do well, he moved the colorist to the back of the property in that barn, and the girls could actually live there. There was dormitory services and a kitchen and a house mother, so to speak. Next slide. This is a sample of what Wallace would use, kind of like a proof. And the girls would actually have to copy this. It goes to the detail. I can't read it from here, but it goes to the detail of the color, actual physical color of the paint that they should be using for each photo. Thanks.
Unbroken Slow.
Oh, I couldn't even read that. Good job. It's a beautiful, and when you look at that, when I first started knowing about Wallace Nutting, I thought his paintings were watercolors. I did not have any idea they were photos that were painted. My grandmother had one in her house, and I just loved it. And my sister Elizabeth also had one. They're just very soothing, and the colors, I like them quite a lot. But I believed that they were watercolors. I didn't understand they started from photos. Of course, each colorist would paint it a little bit different. So if you put them side by side, they wouldn't look exactly the same because some of them might have a heavier brush stroke, or maybe they added a little more pink or a little more green. They were not exactly identical. Next slide. So, yes, one would, yes. but at one time, there might be 5 colorists. They might all be coloring the same thing. They might be all painting the same um, picture, because he would do multiples of each picture. He would do a whole big sheet of paper and in various sizes of the same photo, and then they would paint them. This one, he started with landscapes like this one, which is Spring by the Lake, Spring by the Lake. And also I had my sister bring in hers. Won't be able to see probably because it's dark out. This is called A Sheltered Road. They're really very kind of soothing. You could almost picture yourself walking down the road. All over New England. Primarily at this point in time, he's in Connecticut. So I'm going to guess a lot of these are Connecticut. A lot of the earlier ones were from Connecticut, but he traveled a lot also. He really liked traveling. So you never really knew exactly where they were taken, the photos were taken from. Each of these prints, I'm going to call them prints from now on. Each of these prints were had a name on the bottom. They were signed Wallace Nutting by the head colorist, and they were all matted and framed and ready to go on your wall. They were done in a wide variety of sizes, from 2 to 3 inches to 20 by 30 inches. So, and like Bethy's, I didn't realize that Bethy's is portrait, and many of them are landscape. Most of the ones I've seen are landscape. So he did it both ways, portrait and landscape. Next one, honey. So after he did all the landscapes, he started to get into these colonial posed kind of photos. He really liked the colonial period. He was fascinated by it and the lifestyles of that period of time. So he did probably 20% of his photos were of colonial women in these houses, and the photos are clearly staged. His wife would help stage. I actually saw in a book, one of them, that she actually was attributed to hooking the rug that was in the photo. But she would find a young woman and put her in period garb, and they would decide this furniture should go here and that should go there. Some of the photos were in his houses. Some of them were in other people's houses that he would just go in and say, could I take some pictures in your house? He had 2 basic kind of underlying theories, I guess, of these colonial photos. They were of women either doing something ladylike, so reading or writing, or being productive. So they would be, in this one, I think she's knitting or weaving or carding, doing something with wool. And then there's a few that had actually, she was cooking over a fireplace in them. He wanted to show that period of time, and that all the women, I guess, were very ladylike. He found after the first few photos that they sold better if there was a person in it. So he started putting people in all of them. Next photo. Next slide. This one is called The Merchant's Daughter. This one is a little bit later. This is probably 1910 to 1915. What I put this one in because that really looks like it's a color photo. It doesn't look like something you've hand painted, but it started as a black and white photo. And those granite stairs, I mean, that's a perfect color for granite. The brickwork on the house, you could almost count individual bricks. The painting started to get better and better, and the colors are a lot deeper in these colonial ones. Next, honey. He did travel to Europe, 2 or 3 trips to Europe, and he took some photos there. This happens to be in a Holland scene. Again, he has the women doing something productive, sitting there. I don't know if they're shelling peas or whatever they're doing. But I included this one to show again, he was a genius at composition. He's got the women in the forefront with the brighter colors, and then the background kind of fades away, but you can see it. And the painting is to the degree that you can see individual bricks or individual boards in that. It really, really did a wonderful job as he got more and more experienced with this. He really was an artist. He really, truly was. These did not sell very well, so he doesn't have a lot of these. Okay. Yep. These nothing sold for more than $10. Matted, framed, signed. Most of them were in the $1 to $5 range. Depended on the popularity, and it depended on the size to some degree. It's nothing. $1 to $5, $1 to $10 was the range, but most of them fell in the $1 to $5. Next slide, Harry. He also did a series of miniatures. These are actually 2 by 3 inches. I believe these were probably reframed because they don't have any matting on them. You don't see, can you see Wallace's Nuttings on the name on the bottom maybe? But I think these were probably reframed. You did do that? Okay, my bad. I think they're beautiful, but look at the colors of these also, how much deeper and more vibrant these colors are. They don't look like watercolor. They look a lot more like an oil or an acrylic. He did these typically in florals like this or in still lifes, but he sold quite a number of these smaller ones also. Next slide. Where he really shone and where he really did work wonders, I guess, was in his marketing. And at that point in time, people didn't really market things. It wasn't really, you didn't see a ton of advertisements. He marketed these paintings or prints to the middle class. He said every house should have pictures on the walls. And, at $1 to $10, people could afford them. They were all, as I said, they were all sold matted and framed, so they're ready to go. For $10, you had a really nice picture to go up on your wall. I think this ad mentions that they were in various sizes. They were also, I saw another ad that showed different frames. You could have them in quite a number of different frames. They were greatly recommended as gifts in this ad. It says that. In addition to advertisements like this, he did interviews with Ladies' Home Journal and magazines of that nature, where he talked about his prints, and he said everybody should have one. So he really promoted himself at a period of time when particularly artists did not do that at all. It wasn't considered done. I did see a pic. Oh, yes.
Is that his actual signature?
No, his head colorist typically signed it, but it's pretty close to his signature on the 1936 letter we have. It looks pretty similar to that. He had abysmal handwriting. I couldn't read half of that letter. Worse than yours, Becky. If you can imagine. He also marketed them through department stores. I saw a picture in one of the books I had that there was an entire store window of Wallace Nutting prints, every size, shape, subject you could imagine, and that's how he marketed them. He went to that department store and said, put all my pictures in, you'll sell them. Next slide. This is a different ad. This is a later ad from 1920s, early 1920s. Same signature. That house on the painting in the top is actually Nuttingham. That was his first house in Southbury, Connecticut, that he had the first painted photos coming out of. In his autobiography, he says that he took about 50,000 photos in his lifetime, and that he sold 11 million of these prints. 11 million. Another book I read, though, another book I read said that Wallace Nutting had a tendency to embellish things. So maybe it was only 9 million. Who cares? It's still a lot of pictures. Or 2 million was still quite a lot. I did say that the prints went from anywhere from $1 to $10. This was his most financially significant business endeavor. He had a lot more. We'll go through them, but this was the one that he was known for and that he probably made the most money at. Also, on the bottom of this thing, you can see this ad: Wallace Nutting, the colonial reproduction, colonial reproductions. He made reproduction colonial furniture. He didn't care for the furniture of his time period in the 20s that mass manufactured furniture, he said, was ugly. It wasn't to proportion. The wood was garbage. He really didn't like it at all. This was another part of his kind of genius, though. He did cross-selling, what they call cross-selling, which everybody today does, but in those days they didn't do. He said, if you have a piece of my artwork, you're probably going to want a piece of my furniture because they're kind of the same. So he tucked that little ad on the bottom. I loved that. You will see his prints in antique stores from time to time. I see them quite often in antique stores. They don't go for any money. The most I've ever seen was $50 on them. And many of them are not in terrific shape. Because they weren't expensive, when someone took it off of their wall because they were tired of it, they tossed it in the basement or something. The ones that I've seen have water damage or mold on the bottom of them. So 50 is probably as high as I've seen. One of the books did say that if it was in pristine condition and one of the more rare photos, they can go up to $500. So at no point are they worth a ton of money. But I like them. They're pretty. And on this ad, it's too small for you to probably read, but he says people have begun to copy this process and are hand tinting their photos. Look for one that has the genuine Wallace Nutting signature on it. He didn't say it was his. He just said the genuine Wallace Nutting. Okay, next slide. This is actually an advertisement for Underwood's Deviled Ham. Anybody remember that stuff? It came in that little can that had the paper around it. We saw it at the grocery store this morning, and I was very excited. So he sold this photo to Underwood to use in their advertisement like this. This was 1902. At this point, he was still a minister, and he did not feel he should make money selling photos and be a minister. So any money he made selling his photos before he left the ministry, he just put back into more inexpensive cameras and equipment. Okay, next. So I said in the beginning, one of the things he was an antiquarian. And all I mean by that is he loved the colonial period and even before that period. And he knew a lot about antiques and he knew a lot about the colonial period of time. He believed it was a more simple time. So he turned that love into a business. Next slide. The Wallace Nutting chain of colonial picture houses. So starting in 1914, he bought 5 houses of very old houses, 1646 to 1760 was 1782, all in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Hampshire. And he marketed these like he marketed everything else. At that period of time, automobile tourism was just starting to pick up a little bit, where people would get in their car and drive and look at things. So he advertises these as being an hour apart. That's kind of some of his embellishments. Some of these in this day and age would take longer than an hour to get there. But each of them had a particular feature that he would highlight. The first one, the Ironworks House, he actually turned into his corporate headquarters or company headquarters. But apparently that section of Massachusetts has a lot of iron ore in the ground. And so he started a forge there. And he hired somebody, and part of that was because he was restoring these older homes, he couldn't find good iron reproduction hardware from the colonial period. So I'll just make my own. So he opened the forge to do that one. The second one, the Joseph Webb House in Wethersfield, features murals on the downstairs walls of the Revolutionary War. Apparently, Wethersfield, Washington, and Rochambeau had a headquarters there, and it was a big gathering place for the Revolutionary War. So there were murals there. I don't believe he painted them. I think he just installed them. As part of the restoration process, he bought a bunch of antiques to furnish the houses. And he admitted in his autobiography that he occasionally made a bad buy. Like he would walk into a store and buy the entire store and then get back to the house and go, oh, about half of this is junk. But he collected up quite a lot of antiques in that fashion. When he was marketing these as places to go, he was charging 25 cents a head to get into them. Ooh la la. And other historical house museums at that time were nonprofit and did not charge, and they kind of picked on him a little bit. Look at this guy trying to make money at this. I just think, look at this guy. He saved these 5 houses, and he's educating people. His intention was to educate people, much like the Babcock Smith House. We're going to educate people about the 17th and 18th centuries, the ways of life and the housing and what went on in that period of time, and open their eyes to them. He did use the houses in some of his colonial photographs. He did use rooms in the houses for that. And in this, it was mildly successful, this little endeavor, for maybe 2 years. In 1917, World War I started, and they started to ration gas, even voluntarily ration gas. So people weren't doing the automobile tourism anymore. So he slowly divested himself of the houses. He kept the ironworks for a little while because that was his company headquarters, but he divested himself of the rest of them. Interestingly, of the 5, 4 of them are still open for public touring. The only one that isn't is the Hayes and Garrison House. That's in private hands. So you know what we're doing this summer, Harry? We'll be driving all around. I'd like to see them. I think it would be interesting. The furniture he kept for a period of time, and then in another stroke of genius, he sold a 50% share of the antique furniture from these houses to J.P. Morgan. I don't know what you do with a 50% share of some antiques, but he managed to sell it to J.P. Morgan. Eventually, all of this furniture, plus some of his furniture that he made, was donated to the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford, and periodically they put them on exhibit. We actually also saw them, I believe, in Winter. Yeah, I believe we saw some there. And some of my reference books showed pictures from, how do you say that? Winter. Okay, next. So then, because he had nothing else to do, he started making furniture. And in typical Wallace Nutting style, nothing had a short name. Wallace Nutting True Colonial Reproductions. He started with the Windsor chairs because he was particularly fond of Windsor chairs, and he didn't care for the other reproductions. This is where he says they're made of the wrong wood, the dimensions are wrong. He didn't care for them at all. And as with all of his other ventures, he did a great job marketing them. He cross-sold them with his artwork, and then he always had ads like this. And he used some of these reproductions in his photos. For a time, the Furniture Reproduction Factory was in that ironworks property in Mass. Yeah, he designed and made them. He didn't personally make them. He had people that worked for him. Yeah. Next slide, Harry. I forgot about that. It was 2 of them. These are some of his, another ad and some of his other things. The chest is huge, and then a couple of tables that he made. Studio, yeah, yeah, Framingham, Mass. He ended up in Framingham, Mass. That's where he was toward the end of his life. Okay. Yeah, this was also geared toward the middle class because it wasn't as expensive as a genuine antique, but it was as nicely made. He wanted his furniture to be accurate reproductions at a reasonable price, and sturdy was kind of one of his things too, because a lot of the reproductions were not terribly sturdy. Okay, next slide. Then he became an author. He really didn't sit still a whole lot. He began writing books in 1917, so that's about towards the end of his picture houses, his colonial picture houses. And he wrote them again about things that he knew, and primarily to showcase his photos. The first one he wrote was about Windsor chairs, and it had a myriad of photos of Windsor chairs in it. He didn't like the publishing process, so he started a publishing company. He didn't like somebody editing his work. He didn't like somebody telling him how he should do stuff or when he should do stuff, so he just started his own publishing company called Old America. Next slide. These are a series that he did, and he did them, if you see, it was only 8 years. State's Beautiful series. He didn't do Rhode Island. I don't know why. Because he thought we were Connecticut, probably. Most of them were in the Northeast, but then he did one in England, and he did one for Ireland also. They were really a way to showcase his photos again. They were considered armchair travel books, but they were really not like a travel book you would see today. They were a series of photos, maybe a brief description, and then, but they didn't include where to stay, where to eat, how to get anywhere. They were very difficult to read, quite honestly. I tried reading the Connecticut Beautiful one. He rambled all over the place. He started in New London, and on the bottom of the page, he's talking about Putnam. You can't, there's no connection there. Like, he's not telling you went from New London to Putnam, just beautiful houses in New London and then nice trees in Putnam. And you couldn't make any sense whatsoever out of them. And these were primarily published by his Old America Publishing Company. Some of them were published in coordination with another publishing company. And many of them, these were the first edition, many of them had second editions. Connecticut Beautiful came out in 23 and then again in 35. Okay, Connecticut Beautiful. So Connecticut Beautiful, that's the book that started this discussion. And when Ellen opened it, I'm sure she saw it, I did, inside, written in pencil, probably Gertrude, says, photo of Babcock Smith House, page 142 and 146. So they knew that they were in it, in the book. He featured two things in the Connecticut Beautiful book, the front staircase and the keeping room fireplace. His letter to Phoebe indicated he took a lot of pictures, but these were the only two that were in the Connecticut Beautiful book. Next. This is our front staircase. Clearly, our front staircase. A Groton stair. Darn it all! He fouled that up. And no, it's not attributed to any particular, it doesn't say it's the Babcock Smith House, and he didn't include any narrative in the book about the front staircase. Next slide. And then this is the keeping room fireplace. Again, a Groton fireplace. Well, never mind, it's a fireplace. And he was particularly fond of this fireplace. He obviously staged it. He put a little table there, the sweetheart chair, which comes into play later on in the front right corner is in the keeping room, but not in the fireplace where it would have burned up, so not a great place for it. What he said in Connecticut Beautiful about this fireplace: if one were to copy an old fireplace of the 17th century, he could hardly do better than to do this one entire. He really liked it quite a lot. Next slide. Then he did a series of other books. I mentioned the Windsor chairs. He did 4 on antique furniture. I mentioned the Windsor chairs. He did furniture of the Pilgrim century, which I think my sister has. I've not looked at it. When I saw that one, because I gave it to Bethy, that was the first time I knew that he did anything about furniture. And again, these are intended to showcase all of his photos. They're loaded in photos. The Furniture Treasury was a 3-volume book. The museum has all 3 volumes, and the Clock Book of 1924. The Furniture Treasury has over 5,000 photos in the 2 books, and the 3rd volume is mostly drawings. There aren't very many photos in them. And then finally, he did an autobiography, which he called Biography of Wallace Nutting by Wallace Nutting. It was kind of rambly also. It was not chronological. It didn't start out with I was born in Massachusetts. It was a series of almost essays on adventures in photography, adventures in matrimony, adventures in whatever. Again, not possible to read it. It rambled on horribly. I read some of it and then I kind of gave up. But in 1936, he was 75 years old. So the fact he could write anything in 1936 is pretty impressive. Sorry. Oh, sorry. He didn't think his life was worthy of a book. He didn't plan to write it, but 2 bookmen, that's what he called them, approached him and said, if you write it, we could sell 10,000 copies. Okay, I'll write it if you think we're going to make some money on it. He was an entrepreneur, anything he could make money at. Next slide, honey. So then the Furniture Treasury, I found, also featured 4 items from the Babcock Smith House, all drawings, and some narratives on each one of them. Next slide, honey. The first thing is our corner cupboard. And in the words, he says it's in southeastern Connecticut, and that's all he said. It's clearly our corner cupboard. What he says about the corner cupboard is an unusual and beautiful open shell top corner cupboard with the most amusingly elaborate capitals on its pilasters that one could imagine. See how, remember that they have the 3 capitals, one on top of each other? Apparently that was quite fancy for that time. And he says it's the only corner cupboard of this style that he's seen that didn't have doors in the front of it to protect whatever was in it. I had a guy come through on a tour one time, and he explained to me how those pilasters were carved with a tool that looked almost like a spoon, and you carved down to get the flutes into them. Amazing, the amount of work that went into it. Okay, next slide. That's our front staircase, and if you remember the photo, it looks exactly like this. I think it was drawn from the photo. The shadows are even the same as they were in the original photo. If I was any good with PowerPoint, I could put them side by side, but I'm not that clever. So he really liked the staircase quite a lot. He describes it as beautiful. He described the newel post as unusual. And then he talks about the balusters, or what I would call the spindles, but the balusters. He says, an amusing problem met the builder when he placed the balusters. His 3, each different, repeated nicely until he reached the bottom step where he had to repeat 1 baluster, which I've never noticed. As many times I've done a tour in the house, I've never noticed that there was 4 in there. Next slide, sweetheart. This is the keeping room fireplace, and you can see that this also was drawn from the photo. It has exactly the same things in the photos, the same chairs and everything. He was quite taken with this fireplace. In the furniture treasury, he says, "It is very broad and high, but its crowning merit is in the cupboard space above, conveniently divided into 3 sections by plaster pillars into which a shelf is inserted." He talks about the architect that designed the fireplace. He talks about what a good draw it has. He also talks, and you don't see it as much in this drawing, about the little closet that's to the left of it. He was quite impressed by that. Next slide. And this is the final thing that he had in his furniture treasury. I call this the sweetheart chair. I think that might be what we call it at the museum. It's just how I've kept it in my head. This is also seen in the keeping room fireplace photo and drawing. And he says about this, ancient peculiar specimen in southeastern Connecticut in which the heart motif is employed repeatedly in the reeded balusters. Slight mushrooming of the arm and the style of the turning would indicate a date about 1700. That corresponds completely to what we know about that chair. We believe it to be from the very early 1700s. And obviously handmade. Okay, next. So that's the life and times of Wallace Nutting. I thought he was a really interesting man. He passed away in 1941. He was buried in Maine. His wife outlived him by 3 years, and the balance of their estate was donated to the college she graduated from. Okay, questions? And oh, go ahead.
It's not a question. I taught school. She never heard of her on my
Oh, neat. Oh, that's neat. That would say, yeah. And did somebody bring some in?
Brenda has one. Here we're nodding. I have a lot of photographs of my collection.
Oh, you have a whole collection. Okay, first I want to see Brenda's. Oh, this is just like Sandy. It's similar. Look at this one. It has the birches in it.
Yeah.
He loved birches, and people criticized him because he didn't actually paint the birches because it's on white paper. He just left it white and just painted in the black spot, and he got some good. This one is in good condition. Who has that one? Who has this one? Yeah, bigger.
It belonged to my mother-in-law. I also have made beautiful.
Ah,
And
cool.
I absolutely concur with you. It is impossible to read. There is no organization.
There's no rhyme or reason.
And the photographs are lovely, and I think that photograph is in this book.
Oh, this is beautiful.
It looks like $100 prints and 50 pieces of furniture.
Oh,
What? Did you all hear her? 300 prints and 50 pieces of furniture.
Our house is a Wallace Nutting museum.
I didn't know about that. Are they still? Yeah, when I read about it, it was published probably in the 70s, and it's 500.
How do you know it's his furniture? Does he have a label?
Yes.
He has a label, and some of them have been printed with an iron.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, that is. I particularly like the floors.
Yeah, they're the colors. I know I'm being.
And I've also said
watercolors. You never would
You never
know.
know.
This
I
one
mean,
is.
some of them that are poorly done.
Yeah.
guardian mother.
Yes. And it's kind of a different.
So how did you get started?
Thank you.
Well, I like antiques, and when I go to auction, I come home and look and see. I did have one of his prints, and then I went to auction.
That's how it starts. August, I did a talk about. They have 150 of the stupid things because every time I go to
But 20 years ago, you said the prices very much higher.
Is that 20 years ago?
Oh,
Well,
There is-
ground furniture generally
Like ground
has gone way
but even the
down. Interest in sort of colonial revival has gone down, where interest in either 50s, 60s.
When I was nice, prices were up here.
his furniture is beautiful.
Yeah, the
I assume
furniture.
that's Wallace Nutting.
That piece is
That's
gorgeous.
gorgeous. I really like this
Yeah.
one. I mean, that's really pretty. I've seen this style before, but this one is very, very
Did he literally make the furniture? Like,
Yeah.
did he have
He
people
had
like,
people that did it,
like
but
the
it was
women?
his one. I saw this
Yeah,
in the
yeah,
magazine or in one of his books. It's like
Well,
So,
yeah,
oh, that's cool. Maureen, do you know anything about is anything known about So we don't know whether he chose it because
yeah,
one where they chose to put it.
not. I didn't gather that they were that close.
in some
And I think as he developed, he got better at picking them and he did. The furniture is gorgeous.
Yeah, I was gonna say the furniture's really.
I had never.
we've tried this online.
People now, no market.
No.
Won't get your money back.
Yeah, but if you enjoy it. Sorry, I should not.
No, we'll be around. Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Or statements or?
Thank you.